3. Vosros Denya Island. In 1948, after World War II, the Soviets built a top-secret biological weapons testing facility on a 77-square-mile island called Vosros Denya. The landmass is in a body of water called the Aral Sea, which lies on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The facility, known as Aralsk 7, never showed up on any maps, and authorities went out of their way to keep it under wraps. Staff members experimented with highly dangerous pathogens like anthrax, smallpox, plague, brucellosis, and tularemia. Working on a remote island not only made it easy to avoid eyes, but it was also seen as a way to keep weaponized germs at a safe distance from the public. About 1,500 scientists and employees lived in a village near the facility, known as Kantubek. During the 1960s, Soviet irrigation projects diverted the rivers that fed into the Aral Sea, so it began to dry up. As the lake dwindled, it left behind toxic dust in the air. And while it would take decades before the water surrounding Vosros Denya Island would evaporate, it was clear the lake was disappearing. At the time, the biological agents being used at Aralsk 7 were starting to pollute the air, putting the locals at risk. If and when the water dried up, there was a huge chance the remaining dust would be infested with pathogens. In other words, the situation would only get worse unless serious efforts were made to decontaminate the environment. But nothing was done, and the staff at Aralsk 7 went about business as usual. The dangers of living near the facility became evident in 1971, when an accidental release of weaponized smallpox infected 10 people, killing 3 of them. Authorities scrambled to vaccinate locals while trying to keep the outbreak from making news headlines. About 50,000 people were inoculated against the disease, and the accident remained hidden from the public for decades. In the meantime, the Aral Sea kept evaporating, slowly transforming into a desolate wasteland now known as the Aralkum Desert. But Vosros Denya remained surrounded by water, and operations at the facility kept up. The following year, 2 dead fishermen were found nearby. Their remains showed signs of plague. Locals soon began catching entire nets worth of dead fish. During the late 80s, 50,000 antelope mysteriously died within an hour while grazing near the facility. Around the same time, the Soviet government buried a massive amount of anthrax mixed with bleach in large pits on the island. The pits were so big, they could be seen from space. Aralsk 7 closed down when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, and everyone living in Kantubek was evacuated in the following weeks. The buildings and pathogens were abandoned and left at the mercy of the changing environment. Around the same time, Soviet defectors, including former bioweapons program head Kan Alibek, began spreading word of Vosros Denya. Many of the biological agents were left behind improperly stored in containers. Over the years, they sprang leaks, leaving hazardous germs and cancer-causing pesticides. Just days after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001, letters laced with anthrax were mailed to multiple postal facilities, news outlets, and congressional office buildings in the US. 22 people were infected and 5 died. Having been reminded of the bacteria's deadly potential, the American government organized a project to decontaminate 10 anthrax sites at Aralsk 7 back in 2002. The same year, the public finally learned about the accidental smallpox release from 30 years earlier. Contamination remained an ever-present threat despite the cleanup efforts, and scientists warned the risks of being exposed to deadly toxins would only increase as water around Vosros Denya evaporated. By 2010, the Aral Sea had mostly disappeared and was no more than a handful of small lakes. By then, the polluted island had become a peninsula. In 2008, the water in the area dried up completely, and Vosros Denya became part of the Aralkum Desert. The current pollution levels at the site are unknown, but experts believe the lingering contamination is high. Consequently, the area is off-limits to the public. It's unclear whether any future cleanup efforts are in the works. 2. Korean Demilitarized Zone. In 1945, the US and the Soviet Union agreed to split control of the Korean peninsula, with the Soviets taking over the north and the Americans imposing military authority over the south. 5 years later, in 1950, Communist North Korean forces invaded South Korea. The fighting continued for 3 years in what became known as the Korean War, with the Chinese and Soviets supporting the North and the US backing the South. In 1953, opposing forces negotiated a ceasefire agreement. The war never ended officially and has technically been in a stalemate since. The agreement involved the establishment of a 2.5-mile wide, 154-mile long buffer zone along the 38th parallel, known as the Demilitarized Zone or DMZ. Ironically, it's one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world. At any given time, it's lined with thousands of combat-ready troops, including American forces who've maintained a consistent presence in South Korea since the war. In a section of the DMZ called the Joint Security Area, soldiers face each other from meters away. At the Panmunjom or Truce Village, armistice agreements and other diplomatic meetings have happened since the 1950s. It was also the designated site for military negotiations between North Korea and the United Nations until 1991. Most of the DMZ is scattered with landmines and surrounded by wire fences, and has remained almost entirely untouched by humans since the 1960s. In addition to the risk of stepping on an explosive, anyone who dares to enter this stretch of land from the South Korea side faces the possibility of being shot by a North Korea guard, or taken into custody and either executed or sent to a labor camp, where conditions are so dismal that some have argued death is a better option. A North Korean defector trying to escape to the south faces similar prospects at the hands of their own country's military. But if they manage to reach South Korea, the government will help them start their new life. After undergoing extensive interviews and security checks to ensure they're not a spy, defectors are sent to residential facilities where they start the lengthy process of adjusting to an unfamiliar, modern, democratic society. North Korean defectors typically escape by sneaking across the country's northern border into China thanks to the dangers associated with crossing the DMZ. But people have done it. In one of the most bizarre instances of a defector escaping North Korea, a career gymnast in his 30s managed to scale a 10-foot-high fence and sneak across the DMZ unharmed in 2020. He did it again last year when he defected back, and is probably one of the only civilians to ever successfully accomplish this feat twice. It's rare but not completely unheard of for defectors to return to North Korea. What you may be even more surprised to learn is that a handful of American soldiers have ditched their posts in South Korea and gone to the north. While it may sound like one of the craziest things someone could do, the decision made sense to James Joseph Dresnok, who was stationed in Korea in the early 1960s. After a failed marriage, Dresnok was fed up with life and knew he wasn't fit for the military. One day, he simply walked away from his post and crossed the DMZ. North Korean soldiers approached him with guns ready to shoot, but he held his hands up to show he wasn't armed and didn't have violent intentions. Dresnok was taken into custody and questioned. He joined 3 other US military defectors, and they remained under constant supervision for years as they adjusted to the state's culture and learned the language. The men eventually gained citizenship, and while their new lives were more restricted than the ones they left behind, they enjoyed a more comfortable existence than most North Koreans. Dresnok's story was featured in the 2006 documentary Crossing the Line, which contains a rare interview with him from his later years. When asked, he said he didn't regret his decision to go AWOL and cross into enemy territory. But he knew his every word was being scrutinized by the North Korean minder who accompanied him to the interview, begging the question if Dresnok would have answered differently if his watcher wasn't there. Perhaps he would say that he simply made the most of his circumstances after making a life-changing choice he knew he couldn't take back. He was the last known American to defect to North Korea. While it's incredibly dangerous for humans to enter the DMZ, it has actually become a de facto wildlife sanctuary. It's home to over 5,000 species, including some endangered animals. The closest a civilian can expect to get to the DMZ is Panmunjom, which is open to visitors. There are also guided tours that include visits to observatories along the parallel, offering tourists a rare opportunity to catch a first-hand glimpse of the other side. Foreign tourists in North Korea are allowed to visit Panmunjom, and some points along the DMZ, but they aren't allowed to cross the truce village into South Korea. And it's pretty rare for North Korean citizens to be allowed on these outings. 1. North Sentinel Island. Located in the Bay of Bengal, about 80 miles off the Myanmar coast, the remote Andaman and Nicobar Islands consist of 572 islands. Only 37 are inhabited. In recent years, tourism to these little-known tropical gems has increased, and for the most part, the Indian government is happy to welcome visitors. But there's one island outsiders are strictly forbidden from under any and all circumstances, and with good reason too. Situated among the Andaman Islands, North Sentinel Island is roughly the size of Manhattan. It's home to one of the world's last untouched indigenous tribes, called the Sentinelese. Very little is known about this mysterious society, who researchers believe have spent the last 60,000 years isolated from the rest of the world. Nobody speaks their language, and they've killed almost every outsider that's attempted contact. The first and only peaceful interactions with the Sentinelese took place back in 1991, when a group of anthropologists offered coconuts and gifts from their boat. But the team didn't stay long, and the villagers were quick to warn them once they'd overstayed their welcome. And after a handful of visits, the team had made no progress in understanding the group's language. They realized they could be putting the population at risk of a deadly epidemic. It was also clear the Sentinelese wanted to be left alone, and in 1997 the visit stopped altogether. Given the obvious dangers for everyone involved, it's illegal for visitors to travel within 5 nautical miles of North Sentinel Island. Even the government takes a hands-off approach and has stated its intentions not to interfere with the Sentinelese. But some people can't resist the urge to go, in hopes that the population will be more receptive towards them. In 2004, they shot arrows at an Indian Coast Guard helicopter that was searching for earthquake survivors. 2 years later, 2 Indian fishermen drifted too close to the island in their boat and were killed. When authorities tried to retrieve the bodies, the Sentinelese attacked the aircraft with arrows, so the search was called off. In 2018, a 26-year-old missionary named John Chow traveled from the United States to the islands in hopes of converting the Sentinelese to Christianity. He paid some fishermen to illegally ferry him as close to the island as possible. Chow repeatedly tried to kayak to shore, but was attacked with arrows every time, forcing him to retreat back to the fisherman's boat. He wrote in his diary that he introduced himself to the Sentinelese and told them Jesus loved them, but they remained hostile. And when he tried to imitate their language, they got angry. Eventually, the fishermen saw members of the tribe dragging Chow's lifeless body along the beach and burying him. When word spread out about what had happened, the government arrested the fishermen and 5 others for helping Chow on his deadly mission. Authorities decided against trying to retrieve his body. While killing someone leads to a murder charge in most places, the Indian government didn't prosecute the Sentinelese for killing their visitors. Some people were angered by this when news of Chow's death made headlines around the world. They didn't think it was fair. The Sentinelese were exempt from laws anyone else would have been punished for. Others argued that the dangers of going to the island were abundantly clear, and that if Chow had simply obeyed the law in the first place, the tragedy could have been avoided. What do you think? Should the Sentinelese be charged for killing an outsider, or does it make sense that the Indian government wants to simply stay away? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn about more dangerous and forbidden places, let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.